Welcome to Debt Matters.
Today we're looking at something of a critical challenge for local government here in the UK.
We are. It's this question of how local authorities can possibly balance two opposing needs.
Hmm.
On the one hand, they have to protect their revenue to fund services we all rely on.
Absolutely. Essential services.
But on the other, they have to avoid collection practices that could push residents, maybe residents who are already struggling, into a full-blown financial crisis.
And that's the heart of it. It's a real balancing act. And the information we've been looking at, particularly from StepChange Debt Charity, paints a very clear picture.
They use this great metaphor, don't they? They call council tax debt collection a tightrope for these authorities.
It's the perfect way to describe it because, a misstep in either direction has serious consequences. If a council falls one way,
They lose that revenue, the money for schools, for social care, for bin collections. It's just not there.
exactly. But if they fall the other way, they can be the direct cause of a resident's financial collapse, maybe even a mental health crisis. And that, of course, creates a whole new set of costs for other public services.
So our conversation today is really focused on the arguments for modernizing the whole system. We're starting from the position that this money has to be collected. That's not up for debate.
No, not at all. This isn't about letting people off the hook.
It's about looking at how new practices, things centered on early engagement, on sustainable and affordable repayment plans, can actually avoid all that unnecessary escalation.
And in doing so, save money for everyone and secure a more stable, reliable income stream for the council. We're looking for systemic changes, really.
Moving away from these short-term, high-pressure fixes that often seem to fall apart anyway.
Precisely, towards something that creates long-term repayment and stability.
Okay, so to understand why this is such a unique problem, we have to start with what makes council tax debt different from, say, a credit card bill or a personal loan.
That's the key. Its legal status in England is, it's unique. And that status gives councils a level of leverage you just don't see anywhere else.
And that leverage dictates everything that follows, doesn't it? The
Right.
entire collections process is built on it.
It is. It's the foundation of the whole system. Council tax is a priority debt, and that's because of the laws that back it up. But the crucial point, the thing that sets it apart,
Go on.
it is the only type of debt left in England where not paying can, at the end of a long process, be linked to the threat of going to prison.
And that just sounds, it sounds so archaic. Imprisonment for a civil debt? It feels like something from a Dickens novel.
It does.
If you miss your phone bill or even your mortgage for a while, the consequences are severe. Of course, court judgments, repossession, but never jail. So why does council tax still have what you might call this nuclear option?
It's really a hangover from much older rating systems. The idea was to give local authorities the strongest possible tool to compel payment to fund local services. And while the legal path to get there is complicated,
It's the existence of the path itself that matters.
that's it. So a council gets what's called a liability order from a magistrate's court. Now, this is often a very automated, high-volume part of the process. There's not much chance for a resident to even mount a defense.
And after that order,
After that, the council can apply for something called a committal hearing, and that's where the threat becomes very real.
is that the point where a magistrate can just decide to send you to prison?
Not quite for just being unable to pay. The question for the magistrate is to determine if there has been what's called willful refusal to pay or culpable neglect,
Meaning you had the money but deliberately chose not to pay.
or you were negligent in your financial affairs, yes.
Hmm.
If they decide that's the case, they can impose a prison sentence. Usually it's suspended on the condition that you stick to a new payment schedule.
But if you miss a payment on that new schedule,
Then the prison term can be activated.
so people often dismiss this. They say it's just a theoretical threat, that magistrates would never actually send someone to jail for this anymore. That's not strictly true, is it?
No, it's not theoretical at all.
Yeah.
The Ministry of Justice figures show that the power is still being used. In 2024, 19 people received suspended sentences for council tax non-payment.
19. That number. It's not huge when you think about the millions of households in the country, but that's 19 individuals, 19 families, where this pressure got to the absolute breaking point.
And those 19 cases are just the tip of the iceberg. They don't account for the hundreds, maybe thousands of others who got very close to that point. The hearings that were adjourned, the people who only found the money at the very last second because the threat became so real.
So that power, that ultimate sanction, it just looms over the entire process.
It does. It gives councils and the enforcement agents they hire a tool of fear and pressure that no other consumer creditor has. It shapes every letter, every phone call.
A system built on fear, really. And that brings us to the next point, which is the sheer scale of the problem that this system is now trying to deal with.
And the numbers here are, well, they're staggering.
Let's get into them. The total amount of council tax arrears owed in England has climbed to what figure?
It's reached £6.2 billion as of 2025.
6.2 billion. And that's not just a number on a spreadsheet. That's money that should be funding social care, road maintenance, libraries.
All the core services that communities rely on. But it's the growth rate that really tells the story here.
Yes, that 6.2 billion pound figure, it represents an 85% increase compared to the levels we saw back in 2020.
85% in just 5 years.
Let's just sit with that for a second. An 85% jump. What on earth happened to drive that kind of acceleration in debt?
Well, it's a perfect storm of economic shocks hitting households that were already, just about managing. You had the pandemic, which was the first big blow.
Of course.
Then came the rapid, sustained inflation that just ate away at people's real-term incomes. And on top of that, you had the huge spike in energy costs. The cost of living crisis, essentially.
So it created a whole new group of people falling into arrears for the very first time.
Precisely. If a family is choosing between paying the rent, putting food on the table, and paying the council tax, even with its legal backing, council tax is often the one that has to give. The threat is severe, but it feels more distant than, being evicted next week.
And this 85% growth, it changes everything for the council collections teams on the ground.
It's a fundamental operational shift. You're not just dealing with a small, manageable increase year on year. The size of the debt book has almost doubled in a very short space of time.
So what does that mean in practical terms? Just more work?
It's more than that. It has to change the whole mindset. When arrears grow that fast, you can no longer work on the assumption that most people are deliberately avoiding payment.
This is the distinction between won't pay and can't pay.
Exactly. The old collections model, the one built on that threat of prison, it was designed for a world where you assumed most people in arrears were in the won't pay camp. People who had the money, but were just choosing not to pay.
So the strategy was to be punitive, to be coercive, to escalate quickly, to force them into compliance.
Yes, but that 85% increase tells us the book is now dominated by the can't pay group. People dealing with poverty, with illness, unemployment, other debts. They genuinely do not have the money.
So you have a system designed for one group being applied to another, much larger, much more vulnerable group.
And it becomes not just ineffective, but actively harmful. You're misallocating all this time and resource chasing people who can't pay, escalating them through a system that just adds more costs and more stress onto their shoulders.
And all for what? It doesn't actually bring the money in.
It doesn't. It forces the whole system to confront that tightrope analogy again. The collections teams are being overwhelmed by genuine widespread hardship, but their ingrained processes, their default culture, encourages them to assume bad faith.
It sounds like a recipe for failure. The admin energy goes into following the process, not achieving the outcome.
That's a perfect way to put it. And that mismatch is why this fear-first strategy is now failing so visibly.
Right, let's break that down. The fear-first strategy. We know the legal threat is there in the background, but how does that actually show up in, say, the first letter someone receives?
Well, that first contact is absolutely crucial, and too often it just gets it wrong. It lands on the doormat, and it immediately reads with this underlying assumption of won't pay.
What does that look like?
It's very procedural, very formal. It's filled with legal jargon, references to the Local Government Finance Act. It will often demand the full year's balance immediately.
The full amount.
Yeah.
Even if you've only missed one installment.
Yes, that's often the default legal position, and it's filled with warnings about liability orders, court action, enforcement agents.
Now, from the council's perspective, they probably see that as just doing their due diligence. They have to set out the legal position.
Of course. But think about it from the resident's point of view. Someone who is already stressed, already juggling bills, they open that letter.
And it doesn't motivate them.
It does the opposite. It triggers shame, it triggers anxiety, it triggers fear. Their immediate thought isn't, oh, I should call the council and work something out. Their thought is, I'm in serious trouble. I can't deal with this.
And what's the most common human reaction to that level of anxiety?
Avoidance. Total avoidance. They put the letter in a drawer. They ignore phone calls from unknown numbers. They disengage.
So by leading with fear, the council is actively sabotaging the one thing they need most.
Which is early contact, early, honest engagement. If the resident is too scared to get in touch, the council loses any chance to understand their situation, to check if they're eligible for support, or to set up a payment plan that might actually work.
It's a complete operational paradox.
Yeah.
The stated goal is to get paid, but the method used makes payment less likely.
It is, and the consequences of that avoidance just snowball. Because the resident has disengaged, the process escalates automatically. The liability order fee gets added, maybe £70. The debt gets bigger.
And the threats get more severe.
Exactly. So when contact is finally made, it's not on the resident's terms. It's often because they've received a letter threatening a visit from enforcement agents, from bailiffs.
And at that point, they're acting out of pure desperation.
Pure desperation. And this is where we see people agreeing to these payment plans that are completely unaffordable.
Why would they do that?
To stop the immediate pain. They're not looking at their monthly budget and making a rational decision. They're just trying to stop the bailiffs coming to the door tomorrow. They'll promise to pay £200 a month when they only have £20 spare, just to get that short-term relief.
So they're setting themselves up to fail.
They are. It's a coerced agreement. It kicks the can down the road, but it guarantees the problem will come back, only bigger and more complicated next time.
Let's follow that thread. What happens when that unaffordable plan inevitably collapses? The resident makes one payment, maybe two, by not eating properly or turning the heating off, and then they just can't do it anymore.
They fall behind again. This is what's known as redefaulting. And this is where the fear-first strategy stops being just ineffective and becomes actively expensive for the local authority.
An expensive loop. Let's trace the costs here for a typical case.
Okay, so the resident defaults. The council spends staff time and money getting a liability order, which adds that £70 fee to the debt.
Right.
Then, under pressure, the resident agrees to that unrealistic plan. That takes up more staff time to set up, to monitor. Then, as you say, a couple of months later, it fails.
So they're back to square one.
Worse than square one. The case redefaults. That means more staff time processing it, sending out new letters, and now very often the case is passed straight to enforcement agents.
And they add their own fees.
They do, and they're not small. The statutory fees can quickly add up to over £300 just for the initial stages of enforcement. So the resident's original small debt has now ballooned.
And their ability to pay it has, if anything, gone down.
Precisely. So the council has spent money on court fees, on staff time. They've had maybe one or two small payments, and now they've instructed agents who have added hundreds of pounds to the debt, only to find out the residents still can't pay.
It's just churn. The same cases going around and around the system.
Exactly. High churn. Cases that cycle in and out of enforcement multiple times a year. Every single time that happens, it adds administrative cost, it adds complexity.
Where is the alternative?
The alternative could have been a single one-hour phone call right at the beginning, a proper welfare check, an income and expenditure assessment, and setting up an affordable plan of maybe £10 a month.
The operational cost would be tiny in comparison.
Minimal. And the income, that £120 a year, would be stable, predictable. The fear-first approach guarantees volatile cash flow and a much, much higher cost to collect.
It seems so counterintuitive from a business perspective. But I have to ask the question that I'm sure some councils would raise. What about the people who genuinely won't pay? If you're too supportive, don't you just create a loophole for them to exploit the system?
That's always the challenge, and it's a valid concern. But this is why a modern approach isn't about being soft. It's about being smart.
What's the difference?
The current system, you could say, uses a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It punishes the 90% of people who can't pay just in case they catch the 10% who won't.
So a modernized system still needs that sledgehammer, but keeps it locked away.
It reserves it. It doesn't get rid of escalation and enforcement. It just makes them the final option, not the default one. It's for cases where you can show that genuine support has been offered, it's been documented, it's been exhausted, and there's clear evidence that the person is deliberately avoiding payment.
So you're changing the default assumption.
You are. And you're building a much stronger evidence base for when you do need to take tough action. The current approach just creates this huge amount of admin, a catalog of inefficiency, with staff constantly revisiting the same failed cases. That expensive loop has to be broken.
Okay, so if we agree that the current model is broken, what does a better one look like? It has to start with that very first communication, doesn't it?
It absolutely has to. That first contact sets the tone for everything that follows. The council still needs to be clear, you owe this money, and we need to find a resolution. There has to be authority.
But it's about leading with the solution, not the threat.
Yes. The goal has to be to lower the residents' anxiety, to give them a reason to engage, not a reason to hide.
The material we looked at had a really practical template for this. The suggested opening line was something like, "Thanks for getting in touch. If you're struggling to pay, tell us early and we'll look at affordable options."
And that language is so important. Using the word struggling immediately validates the resident's experience. It shows empathy. And it offers a positive alternative, affordable options.
It's collaborative from the start.
It frames the council as a potential partner in solving the problem, not just an adversary. It gets around that shame barrier that causes so much avoidance.
And the next part of that script gives people a tangible reason to pick up the phone. It says, we can check eligibility for support, pause escalation while we assess, and agree a plan you can keep to.
And those are the three pillars of a modern approach. Checking for support is the council acting as a gateway to welfare. They're not just debt collectors, they're looking to see if the person is missing out on benefits, on council tax reduction, on discounts that could solve the root cause of the problem.
That builds a massive amount of trust.
It does. But that offer to pause escalation, that's the real game changer.
That has to be the single biggest incentive to make contact.
It's everything. The fear of fees, the fear of bailiffs, that's what drives the avoidance and, the panicked, unaffordable offers. If a council can credibly say, talk to us, be honest about your situation, and we will put a stop to any enforcement action while we figure this out,
The whole dynamic changes.
the incentive is no longer to lie or hide. The incentive is to cooperate. You're giving the resident the breathing space they need to be truthful about what they can actually afford.
But let's go back to that won't pay challenge. If you offer to pause escalation, what stops people from just using that as a delaying tactic, dragging it out for months?
Well, the pause can't be indefinite. It has to be a structured, time-bound part of the process.
So you say, we'll pause for 28 days.
And during that time, you need to work with us. You need to provide the information we need to assess your finances. If the resident doesn't engage, if they don't provide that information, then the pause is lifted and the escalation process resumes.
So it's conditional.
It's conditional on cooperation. And what's more, by making that supportive offer and documenting it, you're building your case. If you do eventually have to take enforcement action against that person, you can clearly show a court that you offered help and they refused to take it. It acts as a very effective filter.
So changing the script of that first call is the start. But to make it work, the entire department has to change how it operates.
Yes, this isn't just about retraining one or two people on the phones. It's an operational overhaul.
Where does that start? With the letters?
With all mass communication, the early stage letters, the emails, the text messages, they have to be rewritten from the ground up. They can't be dense legal notices anymore.
The supportive message has to be front and center.
It has to be the headline. We can help. Here's how to get in touch. Here are your options. The legal warnings can be there, but they can't be the first thing people see. The lifeline has to come before the threat.
And then there's the process of agreeing a plan.
Yeah.
You mentioned making it the path of least resistance.
It has to be easier for a resident to agree an affordable plan than it is to do nothing and let it escalate. That might mean simplifying the process. Instead of a 10-page income and expenditure form for a small debt, maybe you have a simplified assessment if someone's on universal credit.
And these plans can't just be set up and then forgotten about.
No, absolutely not. Especially now, with people's finances being so volatile, there needs to be a system for regular, scheduled reviews, maybe every 6 months, a quick check-in. Is this plan still working for you? Has your situation changed? That's how you prevent redefaults before they happen.
This all points to a big culture shift for the staff, though. It's moving them from debt collectors to something more like financial support workers.
It is, and that requires proper investment in training. Not just training on the rules and regulations, but training in soft skills.
Like what?
How to listen for signs of distress. How to recognize indicators of vulnerability. Someone mentioning a long-term illness, a mental health issue, a recent bereavement. Staff need to know how to ask the right questions sensitively to understand the real story behind the debt.
And if they get that information, the systems have to be able to handle it. There's no point identifying vulnerability if it just gets lost in the system.
That's a critical point. If a resident tells you they have a condition that makes it hard for them to deal with phone calls, that needs to be flagged on their account immediately.
And that flag needs to change what happens next.
It has to. It might mean all future contact is by letter. It might mean a longer hold is put on any enforcement action. The automated processes can't be allowed to just roll over someone who has clearly communicated sin sitting. They don't have the capacity to engage in the standard way. The system has to adapt to the resident, not the other way around.
So if you get all of that right, the supportive contact, the focus on affordability, the role of enforcement itself has to change, doesn't it?
It has to change fundamentally. It can no longer be the automatic next step in the flowchart when a payment is missed.
It becomes a last resort.
A considered strategic and ethical last resort. It should be treated like a major business decision, not just an administrative task that gets ticked off.
So what kind of checks and balances need to be in place before a case is passed to enforcement agents?
Well, first, there needs to be clear documentation. Someone, a manager probably, should have to sign off on the rationale. Why is enforcement the right and proportionate step for this specific person at this specific time?
It forces individual accountability.
It does. Second, there has to be a robust check that all the supportive options have genuinely been exhausted. Not just that one standard letter was sent, but that multiple attempts were made through different channels to engage and offer help.
So the council has to prove they did their bit first. The burden of proof shifts.
In a way, yes. And finally, there's the proportionality check. Is it really a sensible use of resources to start an enforcement process that will add £300 in fees to a person's debt when the outstanding amount is only, say, £50?
Almost certainly not. The fees become the main part of the debt.
And you've spent all that time and money and caused all that distress with very little chance of ever recovering the original debt, let alone the fees. It's a self-defeating action.
So this new model reserves enforcement for that small group of people who've been offered help, have the means to pay, and have actively chosen not to.
Exactly. It filters out all the can't-pay cases through support, which frees up the enforcement resources to be used much more effectively and targetedly on the genuine won't-pay cases.
This is such a big change in approach, in culture, in process. It follows that you also need to change how you measure whether it's working or not.
Absolutely. If your only key performance indicator, your only KPI is cash collected this month, you are actively incentivizing your staff to use those high-pressure, short-term tactics.
Because they get quick results, even if they don't last.
They get a spike in payments from people panicking, which looks good on the monthly report, but it creates that expensive loop of redefaults down the line. To fix that, you have to manage to outcomes, not just to raw collection targets.
So what are these new metrics? What should a modern collections team be measuring alongside the cash coming in?
I think the most important one is the redefault rate.
The what rate?
The redefault rate. So of all the people who agree to a payment plan this month, what percentage of them have failed and fallen behind again within, say, 3 months or 6 months?
Ah, I see. And a high rate would be a bad sign.
A very bad sign. A high redefault rate is a direct indicator that the plans you're setting are unaffordable. It tells you your team is relying on pressure, not on realistic assessments. Your goal should be to get that rate as low as possible.
Okay, that makes sense. What's next?
The cost to collect. And this needs to be calculated properly. Not just the obvious external costs, like the fees you pay enforcement agents, but all the internal staff time.
Time spent reopening cases, handling complaints, preparing court paperwork.
All of it. A modernized system should see that cost to collect fall dramatically because you're not cycling the same difficult cases through the most expensive points of the process over and over again.
And finally, you have to measure the human impact somehow, more than just the number of formal complaints.
Yes, you can look at what you might call customer harm indicators. How often are residents being referred on to debt charities after your enforcement action has started? How often do you receive evidence that your collection activity has pushed someone into rent arrears or led to their electricity being cut off?
So you track the negative consequences of your own actions.
You do. And when you measure all of these things, redefault rates, cost to collect, customer harm, alongside the cash recovered, you create this incredibly powerful feedback loop.
It shows that the old methods are not just harmful to residents, they're actually bad for the council's own finances in the long term.
It connects all the dots. It proves that collection based on fear leads to worse outcomes for everyone. And it shows that this modernization isn't just a nice to have. It's the most efficient, most sustainable way to secure the funding that our local communities need.
So when we pull all this together, it's a very clear picture. We have a council tax system that is struggling to cope with a huge rise in arrears, mainly because Its core methods are based on legal intimidation that is now, well, largely counterproductive.
The whole model is too brittle. It's too expensive. It wasn't designed to handle this level of widespread, genuine financial hardship. And the only real path forward, both ethically and financially, is to shift towards this model of early, supportive, and affordable engagement.
To make it easier for people to pay what they can actually afford instead of threatening them into promising what they can't, which just locks in future failure.
That's it in a nutshell.
Now, throughout this, we've talked about that ultimate legal threat, the possibility of imprisonment. Various organizations have argued that this power should just be taken off the statute books altogether. So that leads me to a final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
If the government did that, if tomorrow that unique, powerful leverage of imprisonment was completely removed from council tax collection, how much faster do you think local authorities would be forced to adopt these better, more supportive models, simply because they had no other choice to succeed?
That is a compelling question. Taking away that ultimate legal crutch might be the very thing that forces a universal shift towards the practices that are, as we've discussed, operationally superior and more financially sustainable anyway.
Perhaps the removal of that power is that catalyst the system needs. Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for Debt Matters.
We look forward to connecting with you again soon.